What's up guys, it's Rowan
and Brooklyn
from Art of Smart TV, and we're bringing you episode number 1 of the HSC English Lit Program, affectionately known as HELP, because we all need help for HSC English. Now, one of the key areas that Brooklyn and I from Art of Smart see students struggle with all the time with HSC English is analysis, and being able to actually do high quality analysis. And so one of the things that we thought was really critical is to actually do a deep dive and show you how to do effective analysis, because it's one of those key skills that you need for English, and even more so with the new HSC English syllabus. So in this video, we're going to be unpacking for you how you can craft Band 6 quality analysis, specifically for text and human experiences, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing some nitty-gritty analysis for you to show you how you can do this with the Merchant of Venice, one of the prescribed texts for the common module. Now, what if you don't study the Merchant of Venice? Well, don't stress, we are going to cover some other texts on the common module as well, but either way, you're going to learn a whole lot about how to actually do quality analysis regardless of what text you're actually studying. Now, before we dive in, who are we? Why should you listen to us?
I'm Brooklyn. I have a Bachelor of Arts with Honours in English Literature from Sydney University. I've been tutoring HSC English for 5 years, and I did 4-unit English in Year 12.
Awesome. And my name's Rowan. When I sat at the HSC, I did 3-unit English and I got 95 in Advanced English. Since then, I've spent 10 years teaching HSC English. I've done 10 years of research as well with the top 2% of students across Australia, interviewing state rankers for HSC English to unpack their key strategies. And along the way, I finished an arts law degree at Sydney with first class honours. So let's actually dive in and actually start unpacking for you, how you can get this Band 6 analysis for the Merchant of Venice. Now, I think one of the things that we often see is that, and you might have already just right now recently received an assessment notification for your common module for text and human experiences. And you've got a question that you've got to respond to. Brooklyn, what's the biggest mistake we see students make when they receive these assessment notifications and they start to try to unpack the question?
Yeah, well, I actually think the biggest mistake that they end up making is they start with their thesis rather than with their analysis.
Okay, well, that's sort of mind-blowing for a moment, right? Because you're saying that the biggest mistake is that you shouldn't start with a thesis, that you in fact should start with analysis, which seems to go against sort of, the typical pathway that I see students try to navigate all the time, where, you get the question, you think, crap, like, what on earth am I going to say through this? And then you spend all this time trying to think through what this perfect thesis statement is going to be that you can then use to craft your essay. So what you're saying is, don't do it that way. I'm assuming you're saying that because it's too overwhelming.
Yeah, I think the main thing is you don't actually know what you're going to say until you've started with your building blocks of the quotes, the techniques, and your analysis around them. Then from that point, you can build up to your ideas that they create, and then from that you can build up to a thesis, and then from that you can answer the question.
So it's sort of interesting because at the end of the day, when you write your essay, you're actually really presenting a very different story of how you got there, aren't you? You're sort of leading with a polished thesis statement and then showing the proof that follows from it. But what you're saying is actually the way to get to a good thesis statement is, which I think is really critical for this new syllabus, is to actually have a really strong fundamental understanding of your text. Right? Absolutely. Understand your text and then really pull the thesis out of the text, essentially, but once you've got that foundation. So it's a very different approach, but I think definitely one that leads to stronger thesis statements and therefore stronger responses over the course of Year 12. So, okay, my concern though here is we're back at Challenge 1, and Challenge 1 is, well, if what you're saying is I should be starting with analysis, techniques, examples from my text first before I go to thesis statement, I'm still stuck with the challenge of how on earth do I do good analysis? It's a huge challenge that we see. So from your perspective, if we try to strip things down to fundamentals, what does good analysis look like? Well,
good analysis looks like starting with a technique. What students will often do is they start with a quote, and they're like, this quote says my idea perfectly, and I'm going to put this quote in. But what we actually need to do is start with a technique and show how that technique links to an idea. Because then we've actually got something to say, something interesting to say. If you start with the quote, then you just got to kind of repeat what the quote said.
So I want to get some clarity on this because I'm a little confused and maybe you're confused. So I'm looking at, let's say, the Merchant of Venice. Am I going through the Merchant of Venice and going simile, where is there a good simile, right? Because you said we've got to start with technique. Or am I still fundamentally starting with an example, but then the emphasis of what I'm doing is actually on the technique.
Yeah, absolutely what you just said there. So you want to be going through your text, looking for key ideas, finding quotes that have those key ideas, but then looking at what technique is the composer using in order to show that idea.
So the key here then is actually the core of good analysis is not so much therefore really about the quality of your example, if we're being really honest on itself. It's actually more about to what extent are you using the technique to say something meaningful about that example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's sort of like this core idea in terms of this idea that, of what analysis is, okay? I think now that we've established though, let's dive into the Merchant of Venice more explicitly and unpack actually what this process looks like, because, I'm feeling that, that you may be feeling that all sounds a little vague still, right? And English can have a habit of doing that.
Yeah.
And we want to avoid that here on this show. So before we sort of dive into some analysis, I think, what we sort of pulled out was an idea that exists in the Merchant of Venice is this idea of agency. And you particularly see that through the character of Porsche. And so what we're going to look at here, and we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive, is on, this idea of agency through the lens or the character of Porsche. But before we do that, I think we need to set the scene, and that is, well, what on earth is agency?
Agency basically is your ability to be able to make change in your world.
Nice and simple. Your ability to make change in the world. Fantastic. So now that we've established this, what I want to do, with Brooklyn is really dive in at some examples of how you can build analysis around this idea of agency. So, I think to start with, one of the examples that, we see in the Merchant of Venice relating to Porsche is some of the ways that she's described. Okay, so, she's described as a lady richly left. There's a language like the golden fleece that's used to describe her, and certainly, the idea that many Jasons come in quest of her. So we've found some examples, right, from the text that seem to, say something interesting about Porsche, and maybe say something about agency. I'm there, I've found this, my teacher's told me, I've written this down. Where do I go from there, Brooklyn, if I'm a student trying to actually develop analysis, about these, these ideas, these examples in relation to the idea of agency?
Yeah, so the first thing we've got to do is find the techniques. And luckily, with the quotes that you just said there's a bunch of techniques. So with a lady richly left, we have that idea of economic consumerist imagery. And then the quote, golden fleece and many Jasons come in quest of her, that's actually a mythological allusion to Greek mythology. So that's referring to a story where a bunch of people in Greek mythology go off in a quest for a golden fleece. So what this is actually doing is it's positioning Porsche as a commodity and something that needs to be won.
And I think there's further evidence there with both golden and richly. We've got again some of these just symbols of wealth essentially that are attached to it. So I think what you're saying is we've essentially got an example. We've now identified a couple of techniques, and I think most students from working with them over the last 10 years get to that stage fairly well. The quality of the techniques identification is an area for growth, certainly. But I think most of us can get to that stage, right? Yeah. Where we find an example, we find a technique. Where I think students really struggle is the next step, right? Which is then saying something about that technique and that example relating to agency. So in this case, what could we say? And then what's the critical thing that we need to do here to have high quality analysis?
Well, the critical thing we need to do, to answer your question the other way around,
okay,
is that we want to show the link between the technique and the idea of Porsche's agency.
Okay.
And I think in this quote, the link that we have is the fact that she is presented as an object for male consumption.
Okay, and I guess what I want to dive in there is that what's important in terms of what you're doing is you're not saying that she just doesn't have agency. Okay, so, and I think there's an idea here that I really want to unpack, which is the difference between, I guess, analysis and labeling. Okay, and one of the things that I see students do and really fall short of with analysis is they get the example, golden fleece. They say, great, we've got an allusion to Greek mythology, and they say, therefore this shows that she's a commodity and lacks agency, right? And to some extent, that's okay, right? Like, it's not a horrible piece of analysis, but it's certainly not as sophisticated as it could be, because really all that's happened is labeling. Like, it shows agency or no agency. And that sort of dichotomy is not particularly sophisticated. So what you've said, just to dive into it, is I think something more sophisticated, which is that she's an object for male consumption. So what you're trying to actually do as part of your analysis is looking at agency, say, well, what's something I can say about agency itself rather than just saying it exists or it doesn't exist.
Yeah,
is that right?
Absolutely.
Now, a question I have, just as we've unpacked this, again, I'm putting, my hat on of, being a student myself in the past, but also working with students is, how do I know even that it is an allusion to Greek mythology? I read The Merchant of Venice. I don't understand a lot of it. There's all these, these things within it. If I'm reading this, how am I to get to that sense that, okay, there's actually this allusion to Greek mythology here, and, that whole story, if we, actually understand, the story of Jason and the Argonauts, right, is that, it is, very much this quest for wealth, right? It's for, for wealth and significance, kingship, which is what you've really brought in, right, into your analysis. How does a student get there?
Well, the great thing about Shakespeare is we often have a lot of edited editions of Shakespeare. So the Oxford Shakespeare and the Arden Shakespeare have a whole bunch of notes in them. So if you just find a quote, you'll find at the bottom of the page a note, and it will generally just point out what the allusions are. Okay,
and so you'll still need to go and do a bit of research though, clearly.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
It'll say, yes, there's an allusion here to Greek mythology. You probably then go and need to read a little bit about what happened with Jason and the Argonauts and why then that might say something interesting. So clearly a little tip here is that you want to actually think about what versions of the text that you're reading.
Yeah,
right? Different versions are going to make a significant impact for your level of understanding. You might have a fantastic teacher at school that's sharing this anyway, but The Merchant of Venice is a substantial text. It's unlikely you're necessarily going to get through it in that level of sort of textual detail where all of these are unpacked. So clearly it makes sense to then make sure that you've got good access to some of these these abridged versions of the text to help you understand it. So that's example number one. Hopefully that helps you see how we can take a textual reference, identify a technique, and then unpack some analysis. Let's look at this with another example. And so in this example, we've got Porsche, who is speaking in reference about her house and her servants and herself, and she's saying, I give them with this ring, which when you part from, lose or give away. Let it presage, I'm probably mispronouncing that's the fun of Shakespeare, the ruin of your love, and be my vantage to exclaim on you. Now, first of all, what on earth is Porsche saying here?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. Shakespearean language can obviously sometimes be difficult to understand, but what she's essentially saying is, here I'm giving you a ring along with my house and my servants and everything, and if you lose it, then I have control over you.
Okay, so now that we understand it in plain English, fantastic, okay. I think, what do we do with this, right? Again, I've found this, my teachers told me about this, we're telling you about it, right? It's a great example. What do we do?
Well, same as last time, we find a technique.
Okay, so what techniques do you see?
Well, the one that I actually find really interesting from this quote is that it's quite ironic. She, in the first quote, we've seen that she's been really treated as a commodity. So, Rowan, you're an economics expert. What is a commodity?
So, look, a commodity is typically something that has value, right? It's valuable. So, I think the point that we're trying to highlight here is that, particularly in that first example, Porsche is presented, and there's a whole lot of language that indicates that she's got a lot of material wealth. Yeah. She's valuable for arguably that wealth and nothing more.
Yeah.
So how does that then make sense, and how is that relevant here to this second example?
Yeah, well, she gives Bassanio a ring, and a ring is also a commodity. What she's doing is she's using the thing that she was treated as in order to have control over Bassanio.
Okay, and you're right, there is a sense of irony, because typically, in this case, male and female, right? A male is proposing to a female, generally, particularly at this time, okay? Things have changed since then, which is great. But particularly at this time, it would have been Bassanio giving Porsche the ring, right? So that's what you're getting at when you're saying, well, there's an entire reversal here of actually her giving him the ring and then using that as a device for control, essentially. Yeah. So, okay, now that we've unpacked, there's one technique here, okay, which is this irony. What's the analysis? Because we still haven't actually got to analysis, and again, this is where often I find that students stop, right? They'll explain the technique and what it says about the quote, which is, sort of this, to some extent, lower level labeling, but they don't necessarily then say, well, what this means and really the effect of it in relation to this idea of agency.
Yeah, or they'll just say, it shows that she has agency.
That's right, which is horrible, okay? Basic labeling, don't want to do it. So how do we go above that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think in order to start analysing this, what we want to say is at this moment, Portia is transitioning from being an object of male consumption to a subject of her own experience and actually showing agency.
And how she's doing that, because she...
we want to say how she's doing that, because otherwise I'm doing the exact thing you just told me not to do, right? So I think something that's really important to point out is that she's actually manipulating Bassanio, and that foreshadows some of the things that start to happen later on in the text, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, I think I would just really point out the way that she's gaining agency is actually through manipulation, and that actually makes us question, well,
what's the impact of having agency, right? Clearly there's an impact on others of agency. So we look at agency as a good thing, right, clearly.
Yeah.
But maybe we're starting to say, well, and it is for Portia, we're sort of glad that she's getting some agency and she's not being thrown around as a commodity, but there's also an impact here, and that's where we can start to tease out what might that impact be of her, growing agency that she's developing. Now, I think there's just a point to add here, which is sort of just an interesting, and this is like, because Shakespeare is actually really interesting. I know you probably think, right, no way, I'm struggling through the Merchant of Venice right now. But honestly, I think the interesting thing that's highlighted here, which is a point that you were sharing with me prior, Brooklyn, was that, is there a reason why Portia chooses Bassanio? Bassanio is, out of all the suitors that comes to her, the least wealthy. Yeah. If anything, the money and the wealth and the dowry that she has that she will be providing will really set him, the family, up in a way that does present a significant degree of control. Where if it was someone else, one of her other suitors who was incredibly wealthy, the money's nice, but they're already independently well off, right? So it exerts less control on their life. And so I think that's just an interesting idea that I think is a nice segue as we start to look at the impact of agency and her growing agency. So let's then look at the third and final example. Well, and that example is in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. So, Brooklyn, what's happening here?
Well, just before we get into the quote, I want to mention that this is a significant part in the play because Portia actually has a lot of agency here. She's disguised herself as a man, which is kind of the only way that you get agency in Elizabethan England, unfortunately. So that's the setting here. Mm-hmm. But let's just dig in a little bit more to the quote itself. So, in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. Now, that's actually a very Christian idea. Can you explain that? Yeah,
definitely. So I think, the principle here is that, in the Christian faith, if you're a believer, you go to heaven. If you're not, you go to hell. I mean, that's very simplistic, I know, but core idea. And the pathway to heaven is as a result of salvation, through Jesus Christ, right? And so the idea here is that it's because of his mercy, ultimately, that you receive salvation. Now, of course, there's a little bit of an irony here, though, because Shylock is Jewish.
Shylock is Jewish. So, in some ways, this quote is actually a little bit of an insult to Shylock, because she's basically saying that his identity is a Jew, his religion, it doesn't really matter. She's just seeing the world through her point of view.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are we trying to do with this, though? Because we've got this quote here. I mean, the point of this is, we've got to say something about agency. We've got to have like a technique. I haven't seen a technique yet. I mean, maybe allusion to, Christianity, is that what we're saying here?
And irony, we mentioned that.
Irony, okay, so we have got a couple of techniques, amazing, okay. What are we trying to say, though, here about, agency, right? This is, again, that issue of the thing that we all struggle with is, what do we say, then, about the idea? What are we trying to say?
Yeah, well, one of the ideas that you brought up before this as well was that perhaps agency is actually a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. Explain what a zero-sum game is.
So a zero-sum game is basically the idea that, if there is a winner, there must be a loser, right? So it's not something where if, Portia develops her agency, that's a great thing for Portia and everyone else maintains their agency, okay? Certainly what we see progressively is that as Portia exercises this growing agency, we see, manipulation of Bassanio, arguably his agency diminishes if he's now being controlled through Portia's wealth. We're seeing in this case, yes, she's dressed up and she's disguised herself, but equally she's used some deception, some manipulation here to actually gain her own agency. Unfortunately, it's required in the time. But the point here again is that it creates potentially an outcome where through her own growth in agency, we see Shylock's agency fall away, right? And so we see that it's not that everyone's agency grows, but we see that if one person's grows, others maybe diminish, which I think is an interesting idea.
Yeah, and I think this basically foreshadows the ending of the court scene where Porsche tells Shylock that his life is at the mercy of the Duke, and then Antonio ends up telling him that he can't be a Jew anymore and he has to convert to Christianity. So that's basically entirely stripping Shylock of his agency and his subjectivity, and just like Porsche was at the beginning, he just turns totally into an object.
Mm-hmm. And so there we go. And so we can really say then, if we're looking at agency, the idea, what we're saying about agency, therefore, here is not that Porsche now has it, Shylock doesn't. Although that's true, okay? What we're actually saying is something more than that, what Shakespeare seems to be illustrating is that it's a zero-sum game, that as one person gains agency, it can have detrimental impacts on the agency of others. And so therefore, it's not necessarily inherently always a good thing, right? Despite, I think, our modern perception of agency being something that, we all want to exercise in our own lives. So, guys, there you have it. We've just unpacked 3 examples from the Merchant of Venice. We've looked at how you would take an example, how you would look at techniques, and then actually develop your analysis and say something more meaningful than simply just labeling that agency exists or it doesn't exist. And that's really, really critical. So as an editing technique that we'd really encourage you to use in your work as you're preparing for your upcoming assessments is to go through your analysis and ask yourself, am I just simply saying that, that my idea exists or doesn't exist? Or am I saying something particular about this idea, and what am I saying about the idea? If you don't have that, then you know that you've got work to do on your analysis. So look, if you found this video helpful, and we hope you have, a couple of things. Number 1, hit that subscribe button. This is the first episode of many more that we'll have for the HSC English Lit Program, otherwise known as #help. So to continue to get support for HSC English, hit subscribe. Now, secondly, if you found this helpful and you've had some sort of brain explosions around, wow, I've been doing everything wrong, I've been starting with, thesis instead of analysis first, and I've been labeling, and you guys made it look really easy, but I really struggle with it. We have an incredible team of teachers and tutors at Artist Smart across all of Sydney and at our campus in Hornsby. And this is what we help students do. We help students get into your specific text and help you actually, with your examples, develop your analysis to go beyond simply just labeling, because that's not a pathway to great results. So if you do need more help, get in touch with us. We've got an incredible team that can work with you at your home or in our campus. Otherwise, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.